man in his 40s, living alone in an old and poorly lit apartment. He is a lonely, introverted figure, perhaps a little cynical, with few social connections. Works in a bureaucratic job that does not require much emotional involvement. John has a past he avoids thinking about, marked by events that he buried deep. Perhaps he has left behind a small town where an accident or tragic event occurred that he is trying to forget. These memories are vague, but they haunt your dreams. John's routine is monotonous and repetitive. Work, dinner alone, watching TV until late, sleeping. He is stuck in a life cycle that seems empty, but which he prefers to the alternative of confronting his past. On a particularly quiet night, John suddenly wakes up at about 3 a.m., the devil's hour in popular tradition. The feeling of something wrong awakens him, but he does not know what it is. He feels a shiver in the spine, as if being observed. Hesitantly, he gets up from bed and, still half groggy, walks into the room. There, at a glance, he sees a dark figure, standing in the darkest corner of the room. The figure is hooded, so that its face is impossible to discern. John blinks, wondering if he is dreaming, and when he looks again, the figure is no longer there. He tries to calm down, telling himself it was just a trick of the mind, but can't get away with the feeling that something was profoundly wrong. Even trying to rationalize what he saw, John cannot go back to sleep. He is rolling in bed, his mind working frantically to find an explanation. Thoughts begin to arise in his mind, fragmented memories of what he has been trying to forget. During the day, he feels nervous and distracted. At work, he makes simple mistakes, and his colleagues comment that he seems exhausted. John feels a growing discomfort, as if something bad is about to happen. That night, when he goes to brush his teeth, John notices a mark on his arm, as if he had been touched or grabbed by something. The mark is small, but it wasn't there before. He tries to convince himself that it's a coincidence, but fear grows. When night falls, John begins to feel anxious. He hesitates to go to bed, fearing what might happen. He locks all doors and windows, but deep down knows that it will not prevent anything from coming back. After the first disturbing visit, John tries to convince himself that it was only a dream, but restlessness remains. He goes to bed early, trying to relax and convince himself that nothing abnormal will happen. At about 3 o'clock in the morning, John wakes up abruptly again, as if he had been pulled out of a deep sleep. This time, he doesn't have to leave the room to realize that something is wrong. The hooded figure is now at the foot of the bed, closer than before, completely immobile. Despite the darkness, John can see more details of the figure. She is tall, wrapped in a black cloak that seems to absorb the light around. The face is still hidden by the hood, but John feels that he is being watched by eyes he cannot see. The silence is absolute, and John feels an inexplicable cold running through the room. He tries to move, but is paralyzed by fear. The figure does not speak, but its presence is overwhelming, conveying a sense of imminent threat. Then, without any perceptible movement, the figure disappears as suddenly as it appeared, leaving John stunned and panting. In the following nights, John begins to have intense nightmares and flashbacks of events he barely remembers. He sees himself in a specific situation, an event of his past that he has tried to bury, perhaps a car accident in which someone died, or a betrayal that resulted in terrible consequences for another person. During the day, these flashes make you distracted and confused. He tries to ignore them, convincing himself that they are only dreams induced by stress and lack of sleep. However, each nightmare is more vivid than the previous one, as if something was trying to force you to remember. John begins to realize that the events shown in the nightmares are directly linked to the hooded figure. It is as if she was trying to communicate or punish him, bringing up memories he would rather forget. The presence of the hooded figure is no longer limited to the night. During the day, John begins to perceive his silhouette at a glance, in reflections of windows, in mirrors, or even in the crowd. Each time he looks again, the figure is not there, but the fear remains. John begins to isolate himself even more, fearing that others will realize that something is wrong with him. He stops answering calls and avoids leaving the house unless absolutely necessary. When you leave, you feel like you are being followed, although you can never find anyone. The constant and growing fear begins to affect your mental and physical health. John has trouble sleeping, becomes obsessed with trying to prepare for the next visit. He buys additional locks, security cameras, and even tries to use salt and other superstitious methods to protect himself. However, deep down he knows that none of this will be able to stop the figure from coming back. Every night, John wakes up more tired and disturbed. He begins to notice small changes in his home, such as dislocated furniture, doors that he is sure had closed now open, and even unexplained marks on his body. Paranoia reaches its peak when he finds a mark on his skin, similar to the one he saw on the first night, but deeper and more painful. On the third visit, the hooded figure not only appears but also begins to interact directly with John. He wakes up in the middle of the night, but this time, instead of seeing the figure at the foot of the bed or in the corner of the room, he finds himself in a different place. It is as if he has been transported to a memory of the past, but the hooded figure is there with him, watching. The memory that emerges is of a specific and traumatic event that John tried to erase from his mind. Maybe he is in a car, driving on a rainy night when an accident occurs. In the passenger seat, a vague figure representing someone he knows well is present, and the hooded figure appears in the rearview mirror, like a dark specter observing everything. John relives the moment he made a critical decision that changed the course of his life and possibly ruined someone else's life. It may be that he has fled from the scene of the accident, abandoning someone to his own fate, or betrayed a friend irreparably. The hooded figure seems to absorb the pain and regret of John, as if he was there to punish him. John wakes up suddenly, soaked in sweat and trembling, as if the memory was as real as the hooded figure itself. He feels a deep sense of guilt and shame, as if the past he was trying to forget is finally catching up with him. However, he is still not sure whether what he saw was a dream or a physical manifestation of the figure. After this revelation, John begins to feel the physical effects of the visits of the hooded figure. He wakes up with body aches, unexplained marks on his skin, like scratches or bruises, and extreme tiredness, as if drained of energy. The influence of the figure begins to manifest itself in tangible forms in your home. Objects move, doors he locks appear unlocked, and old photos he had kept begin to appear in unexpected places, as if the figure was trying to force John to confront his past. On one of the nights, instead of just appearing, the hooded figure whispers something to John. The voice is cold and full of malice, and says something that John fears hearing. "You cannot escape what you have done." These words echo in his mind, intensifying paranoia and terror. Desperate, John decides that he needs to leave his house, believing that the problem is connected to the place. He packs his bags in a hurry and leaves for a hotel or a distant friend's house, trying to distance himself from what is happening. However, constant fear and paranoia follow him. Even far from home, John does not find peace. He begins to notice the presence of the hooded figure in the most unexpected places. In the reflection of a car window, in a dark corner of the hotel, or even in the crowd on a busy street. It is as if the figure was chasing him relentlessly, without rest. John realizes that he cannot escape the figure, for it is not limited to a physical place. It is connected to him and his past. This understanding forces him to consider the possibility that the only way to stop visits is to confront what he has done and accept the consequences. Tired of running away and feeling cornered, João decides to go home and face the hooded figure once and for all. He readies his house, prepares himself mentally for the meeting, and awaits the next visit with a mixture of fear and resignation. The night he decides to confront the figure, John prepares as if it were for a battle. He puts the old photos on the table, mentally relives the moments that he fears most, and finally, sitting in the dark room, waits for the arrival of the figure. On the fourth visit, the hooded figure not only observes John, but leads him to relive another terrifying and crucial memory of his past. John finds himself in a place he recognizes immediately, an old house he used to visit when he was young. The house is in ruins, with walls covered with moss and the ceiling falling apart, but the atmosphere is heavy with the weight of memories. John sees a younger version of himself confronting someone in one of the rooms of the house. The discussion is intense, loaded with anger and resentment. It may be an old friend, a relative, or someone John betrayed or hurt badly. The hooded figure is there, watching everything quietly, like an impassive judge. The scene culminates in a shocking revelation. Perhaps John caused the death of this person, either directly or indirectly. What once seemed like an accident or an impulsive decision is now revealed as a premeditated act, or at least preventable. The hooded figure seems to absorb the truth of the scene, becoming even more threatening and gloomy. John is pulled back into reality, but the guilt and dread he felt during the vision remain with him. The figure disappears once again, leaving John at the mercy of his memories and the growing terror he feels for himself and his past actions. After the second revelation, John begins to lose his sense of what is real and what is imagination. He sees the hooded figure everywhere. In the shadows of his apartment, in the reflection of the windows, even on the street during the day. He begins to doubt his own sanity, questioning whether he is really seeing the figure or if it is all fruit of his mind in collapse. Disturbing sounds begin to echo in your house. Whispers in the middle of the night, footsteps dragged in the corridor, banging on the walls. When John tries to locate the source of these sounds, they cease abruptly, leaving him in a constant state of alert. He begins to hallucinate, seeing distorted faces and mutilated bodies in the most unexpected places, as if his past was literally coming back to haunt him. John turns away completely from the outside world. He stops going to work, avoids any contact with friends or family, and closes himself in the home, where he feels safe and prisoner at the same time. His home, once a refuge, is now a prison where he faces his own terror at every moment. John develops an irrational fear of mirrors, believing that the hooded figure can appear at any time through them. He covers all the mirrors of the house, but still feels the presence of the figure, as if she is lurking just behind him. John begins to have disturbing visions of his own death. He sees himself being attacked by the hooded figure, or in a horrible accident that leaves him mutilated. These visions are so vivid that he wakes up with the taste of blood in his mouth, or feeling pain in the limbs that have been mutilated in his nightmares. Objects in your home begin to become vehicles of terror. A chair that moves itself, a clock that stops at exactly 3 o'clock in the morning, or a television that turns on by itself and shows scenes of violence and death. Each of these events seems to be a warning from the hooded figure that something worse is coming. John begins to have visions of future events, always ending in death or destruction. He sees the hooded figure as an inevitable presence in these events, as if it is there to ensure that John's destiny will be fulfilled. These visions terrify him, but also leave him resigned to his fate, believing that there is nothing he can do to change what is coming. Tired and desperate, John decides that the only way to end the terror is to confront the hooded figure directly. He prepares for the meeting, armed with anything that he believes can help: crucifixes, amulets, or even a weapon, although he knows deep down that none of it will be effective. The night he decides to face the figure, she appears, but this time, something is different. The hooded figure does not move, but the atmosphere around it is charged with an evil energy that makes the air seem dense and suffocating. John tries to talk to her, demand answers, but his words come out weak and confused. The figure finally reveals its true nature and purpose. It is a manifestation of John's sins and errors, a specter that he himself created over the years of denial and guilt. She is not there to kill him, but to make him face what he has done and what he has become. John, exhausted physically and emotionally, prepares for what he knows to be the last visit of the hooded figure. That night, the figure appears differently, almost as if his presence was growing in intensity and clarity. She is no longer just watching. This time, she approaches John, who feels the weight of imminent death, as if each step of the figure drains life around him. The figure finally reveals itself. With a slow and deliberate movement, she removes the hood, revealing John's face, but not the John of now. It is a distorted, aged, and haunted version, as if John himself had been consumed by evil and guilt over the years. He realizes that the figure is a personification of his own corrupted soul, a physical manifestation of his deepest sins and regrets. The figure, now revealed as a future and condemned version of John, begins to speak, his voice a dark and deep echo. It forces him to revisit every crucial moment of his life where he made selfish decisions, harmed others, or refused to accept responsibility for his actions. Each word said by the figure is a blade that pierces the already fragile sanity of John. After this revelation, John begins to experience rapid physical and mental deterioration. Your body visibly weakens, your hair turns gray, the skin wrinkles and loses color. He feels constant pain, as if his body is being corroded from the inside. Mentally, he is tormented by incessant voices and visions of his own death, of his wasted life, and of the people he has hurt. The line between reality and hallucinations is completely blurred. John begins to see the faces of people he has wronged everywhere, distorted by pain and hatred. Objects in his house gain life of their own, appearing to move or change place when he is not looking. The house turns into a maze where each open door reveals a new nightmare. John begins to speak alone, his mind divided between guilt and anger. He blames himself for everything that has gone wrong in his life, but also tries to justify his actions by creating a cycle of self-recrimination and denial. His mental health degrades to the point that he can no longer distinguish between his own thoughts and the voices he hears. The hooded figure begins to reveal truths about people close to John. He discovers that his actions have had wider consequences than he imagined. Perhaps a close friend committed suicide because of John's betrayal, or an innocent person suffered a horrible fate for something he did. Each new revelation is a blow, leading John to despair. John begins to remember people he has forgotten, old friendships, relationships, and family members he has neglected or pushed away. He sees how their actions, or lack of them, contributed to the loneliness and disgrace of these people. The hooded figure forces him to face these realities, making it clear that his life is marked by a series of errors and omissions that he can no longer ignore. John realizes that he is being pulled down a downward spiral, where each revelation makes him weaker and more vulnerable. He begins to lose control of his own actions, as if being manipulated by an invisible force. He may begin to hurt himself without realizing it, or destroy objects in his home, in a desperate attempt to free himself from torment. In the final hours before the climax, John begins to have detailed visions of his own death, each more horrible than the previous one. He sees different scenarios: being buried alive, drowned, or falling into an endless abyss. Each vision seems incredibly real, and he wakes up in panic, but always in the same chair, in the same dark room, with the hooded figure by his side. The hooded figure gives John a terrible choice: face death now, in a slow and painful way, or continue living, but with the certainty that his fate will be worse than death. It is a choice between eternal suffering and immediate relief, but with the awareness that both are punishments for the sins he has committed. At the height of his despair, John cries out for redemption, begging for a chance to redeem himself. However, the hooded figure remains impassive, suggesting that it is already too late for any kind of salvation. John realizes that he is trapped in a cycle of guilt and self-punishment that he himself created, and that there is no way out of this personal hell. In the final moment, John accepts that there is no escape from the fate he himself has forged. He surrenders to the terror that consumed him, understanding that the hooded figure is an inseparable part of himself, the reflection of all his errors and omissions. With this acceptance, he prepares for what is to come, whether death or something even worse. When John finally surrenders, hoping his life will end, something unexpected happens. The hooded figure disappears, but he feels no relief, only a terrifying emptiness. He realizes that the true punishment is not death, but continuing to live with the unbearable weight of his guilt and repentance. Perhaps the real punishment is to live forever trapped in your own mind, reliving your worst moments without end. Each night, the hooded figure becomes more active, not just appearing but starting to interact directly with John. Initially, these interactions are subtle, like moving objects in your home or whispering incomprehensible words. However, as the nights pass, the interactions become more intense and invasive. In one of those nights, John feels a cold touch on his skin, as if the figure had materialized physically. He wakes up overwhelmed, feeling a cold mark on his arm, which remains even after the figure disappears. The touch leaves a bruise, a physical sign of the increasing control that the figure exerts on him. John begins to find objects in his house that do not belong to him. Perhaps they are old items, related to his past or traumatic events that he has tried to forget. These objects, like an old photograph, a stopped clock, or a rusty ring, are always associated with painful memories and seem to be brought by the hooded figure as a way of torturing Joao with his own story. John begins to have recurring nightmares that make him terrified. In these dreams, he is pursued by faceless shadows, or sees himself trapped in a dark and unknown place with no way out. Each nightmare seems more real than the previous one, as if they were an extension of the nocturnal visits of the hooded figure. In one of the most disturbing nightmares, Joao dreams of his own death. He sees himself in a coffin, surrounded by people he does not recognize, and the hooded figure is there, like a silent observer. He tries to shout, but is mute. He tries to move, but is paralyzed. The feeling of being trapped in your own body, helpless and vulnerable, is terrifying. Joao begins to realize that the nightmares do not end when he wakes up. On the contrary, elements of dreams seem to infiltrate his awakened life. He begins to see the shadows of his dreams in the corners of his vision, or hear the disturbing whispers of the figure even during the day. The line between dream and reality becomes increasingly blurred, plunging John into a spiral of confusion and fear. John's life begins to crumble. He loses his job, drives away friends and family, and becomes a recluse, unable to face the outside world. His home, formerly a refuge, is now a prison where terror grows every night. He spends his days in a state of constant anxiety, waiting for the next visit of the hooded figure. John begins to see things that are not there. Faces on the walls, voices coming from inside the objects, and the hooded figure in places where it should not be. He begins to believe that the figure can read his thoughts, predict his movements, and that it is playing with him, manipulating his emotions and his perception of reality. John begins to lose track of time. He realizes that hours, even days, go by without him noticing. He wakes up in strange places inside his own house, not remembering how he got there, and finds objects displaced as if someone, or something, had been there while he was unconscious. John begins to realize that his memories are changing. He begins to remember events that never happened, or different details in old memories. The hooded figure seems to be rewriting his past, distorting his memories to make him question everything he thought he knew about himself. On a particularly disturbing night, the figure reveals to John a truth which he had buried deep. Perhaps he has committed a terrible crime, or was responsible for something monstrous that he refused to acknowledge. The hooded figure forces him to relive that moment, revealing that all the torment he is suffering is a result of his own past actions. John realizes that the hooded figure is a physical manifestation of his own guilt and regret. Everything he tried to hide, forget, or ignore is now coming out, and he can no longer escape the truth of who he is and what he has done. In one of the last visits, the hooded figure finally reveals his identity. She is the embodiment of John's worst fears, an entity that feeds on his guilt and fear, growing stronger as John deteriorates. The figure is not just a ghost or a demon, but a creation of John, born of his own tortured mind. John, desperate and without alternatives, decides to face the hooded figure one last time. He challenges her, trying to end the torment that consumed him for so long. But in doing so, he realizes that the confrontation is actually with himself. The figure reveals that, to end suffering, John must accept the truth about himself and his actions, something he has avoided from the beginning. Unable to bear the truth and the emotional burden that comes with it, John finally collapses. His mind is fragmented, leaving him at the mercy of the hooded figure, who now completely dominates his psyche. He is consumed by the figure, which becomes one with him, ending the cycle of terror. After the final confrontation, John's fate is left ambiguous. Perhaps he is found dead in his home, with an expression of absolute terror on his face. Or maybe he will disappear completely, leaving only a disturbing mystery for those who knew him. The hooded figure, however, remains as a shadow in the house, an eternal presence waiting for its next victim. The story ends with a dark message about the nature of repentance and guilt. John is just one example of how the secrets of the past, when buried and ignored, can grow into something monstrous. The hooded figure, now free of John, continues his search for other tormented souls, perpetuating the cycle of terror.